Elizabeth and I are going to experiment on telling the story of the Unitarians and the Universalists coming together.
And this might be a little easier if we could see each other, but we're going to see what happens here. So, Reverend Clyde, how did the Universalists and Unitarians start to come together?
Well, let's go back to when they were very separate. The Unitarians arose in the time of the American Revolution and afterwards over a theological dispute between those who thought that Jesus was a teacher of divine inspiration, but not God, who died on the cross to pay a price for the original sin of Adam and Eve. So they did not believe in what we call the Trinity. The Universalists argue that God's love, everyone would be reunited in God in the life to come. In other words, there was no hell. They were two different positions, but two movements had a lot in common, and many individuals agreed with both. Some people said, I'm a Universalist, but I go to a Unitarian church, and etc.
Do you have a joke that might sum up the positions of the Unitarians and the Universalists?
Well, you could tell a joke. Let's
great.
see. Huh?
Yeah, so supposedly this is attributed to Starr King, who was at different points both a Unitarian and Universalist minister, but it's not that funny, don't get excited. But his joke was that the Universalists believed that God was too good to damn man to hell, and the Unitarians believed that man was too good to be damned.
No, they were too damned to be damned.
Sometimes just the Unitarians were too, yeah.
Well, so what kept the Unitarians and the Universalists apart? If they had so much in common, why didn't they just merge?
So the American Unitarians and Universalists had a lot of class differences as movements. The Universalists tended to be farmers and factory workers and business people, maybe small businesses, while the Unitarians in America prided themselves on being part of the elite. They were often college professors and presidents, principals, prominent physicians or lawyers or merchants and entrepreneurs. But over the next century, these movements became more and more alike. Unitarians might still maybe be more elite, but the Universalists were becoming part of the middle class. And more Unitarian and Universalist ministers, like we were saying, were actually preaching in both denominations or going back and forth. And dozens of individual Unitarian and Universalist churches actually started to merge. So, Reverend Clyde, what happened next?
Well, I'm going to tell a story before we tell you what happened next. I served a little congregation, in Quebec. And when I read the history of that congregation, here's how it happened. The Universalists had 50 congregations in Quebec. And the congregation, our congregation, was basically a Universalist preacher came to town, very famous Universalist preacher, and he preached sermons, and people came and camped in tents there, and then they started cutting up wood, and they chopped down trees, and they turned the trees into lumber and built a meeting house, all in one encampment while this preacher kept preaching every day, universal love. So this story is that this congregation, and the meeting house still stands, beautiful meeting house. Most of the carpenters turned out to be boat makers because the roof of the meeting house has got a boat-like structure. So this is the Universalists didn't hire architects and contractors. They just built the church. They were farmers. As when I served the church, there were a lot of college teachers and doctors, and so the Universalists became more middle strata, and the Unitarians stopped being professors, I guess. So you want to ask that question again?
Oh, yes. So what happened around the 1930s?
Well, the 1930s, the Great Depression was very difficult on congregations, and it was more difficult, well, not more, but it was difficult for the Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church to survive. All the denominations, because the congregations were having trouble, they weren't sending money to headquarters. Make sense? And so the idea of consolidating the denominational structures to have one, instead of paying two presidents, you pay one president, etc., that kind of thing, it occurred to everybody. Everybody started talking about merger during the 1930s. And we made the following things merge with the Universalists. We brought out a common hymnal, that both the Universalists and the Unitarians had a common hymnal called Hymns of the Spirit. I bet you there are folks here who remember the red hymnal. That's the Hymns of the Spirit. 1937 was the first edition of the Hymns of the Spirit. The other thing that merged was the religious education department. So they had curriculums coming from this department were common to both Unitarians and Universalists. And anything else merge in that time?
And the youth group, which formed LRY, which was the Liberal Religious Youth.
Yes, the youth group merged. I'm going to try to think. There's one other we're missing.
If we're missing something,
publishing houses.
Oh, yes.
So Beacon Press came to, and Skinner House. Skinner House publishes the stuff that we keep to ourselves. And the Beacon Press is for the bookstores, and they were both founded merging the denominational publishing efforts. There were many publishing efforts before the 30s, and now that there were these two held by both denominations. So what kept, that's 1935, 34 to 1961, they keep merging things. Why didn't the denominations just merge? Anybody got a guess?
Oh.
Building. Good guess. People love their buildings. The bureaucracy. If you merge the Universalist bureaucracy and the Unitarian bureaucracy, who gets first base and who gets second base? Basically, figuring out how the structure would work of all those employees. So in 1961 is when the merger took place. Elizabeth, any more questions, thoughts?
Not unless you have a final joke for us.
No, do I have a final joke? The Unitarians and the Universalists congregations, as they approached the merger, were very worried about what would happen on the other side of it. Once we merged with the Universalists, what would happen? And the Unitarians said, we're going to lose our emphasis on reason and search for truth, because we'll get all sentimental with those Universalists who love to talk about love and love and love. And the Universalists said they were going to, if they merge with those Unitarians, we'll lose all our spirit and our love and our emphasis on goodness. And when the merger happened, it seemed like the Universalist worry was right. The people would just refer to them, those Unitarians, meaning both of them. No, people didn't talk about the Universalists hardly at all anymore. And there was a lot of emphasis, a lot of the literature was about rationality and reason and search for truth and stuff like that. Years went by, and the youth started talking about spirit of love, and standing on the side of love, and siding with love, and which goes to prove, and that as much now the new articles of that we're developing says that what holds the Unitarians and Universalists together is love, which goes to prove you are what you eat. Unitarian Universalist congregations covenanted to affirm and promote these 7 principles and to lay claim to these traditions that formed us. We hold as strong values and moral guides. We experienced the 7 principles as in the reading just now, and we read them together, but the 7 principles do not function as beliefs. They're not creeds. Rather, they're affirmations, aspirations. We're not declaring that justice and equity are the way things are. We don't say that. We're declaring that that's the kind of world we seek, we envision, we hope for. We devote ourselves to its realization. We don't say we believe every person is honest and worthy. We don't say that. Rather, we commit ourselves to living into the worth and dignity of every person. Member congregations affirm and promote these principles. We also affirm that we're informed by a living tradition of wisdom and prophecy and deep traditions of spirituality drawn from many sources as diverse as science, poetry, personal experience, and history. Right after the 7 principles, we read these words: the living tradition we share draws from many sources, and we identify 6 sources as informing and inspiring Unitarian Universalist thought and action. This wasn't always the case. The living tradition reveals how much Unitarian Universalists have redefined themselves in recent decades. At the time of the merger of the Unitarians and Universalists, the work took place in 1959 and 1960 when the 2 denominations wrote their constitutions and bylaws, and the first General Assembly of the UUA was 1961. We agreed to a statement of purpose that reflected liberal Protestant roots of the Unitarian Universalists. But we were changed people 3 decades later when we wrote these principles and purposes. Changed. The conversation over 1,000 congregations, we wrote the original statements of purposes. The original statements of purpose of the UUA reflected who we were in 1961. And it read, members of the Unitarian Universalist Association, dedicated to the principles of a free faith, unite in seeking to strengthen one another in a free and disciplined search for truth as the foundation of our religious fellowship. To cherish and spread the universal truth taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition. Immorality, immorably, summarized by the Judeo-Christian heritage as love to God and love to man. To affirm and defend and promote the supreme worth of every human personality and the dignity of man and the use of democratic method in human relationships, to implement our vision of one world by striving for a world community founded on the ideals of brotherhood, justice, and peace, to serve the needs of the member churches and fellowships, to organize new churches, fellowships, and to strengthen our liberal religion, and to encourage a cooperation with men of goodwill in every land. Does that sound like 1960? No. In the years after the mergers, events had happened that made this founding document problematic. In the mid-70s, there was the civil rights movement of African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, American Indians, and that awakened the conscience of the Unitarian Universalists to recognize world brotherhood really didn't say it all. They had new understandings of justice and beloved community. And the long and disastrous war in Southeast Asia had given us a new focus on world community and wise skepticism concerning the righteousness of U.S. foreign policy. The women's movement had challenged the presumptions of hierarchy and insisted on the need to bring forth a women's perspective on religion and ethics. There was the beginning of what we now call the gay liberation movement, and the beginning of struggles for equality. We voted to affirm openly gay and lesbian ministers, to encourage our congregations to welcome non-heterosexual families. Both Unitarians and Universalists seemed to be divided over what was called the humanist-theist debate. This was a very sharp debate, back and forth. A goodly number of congregations were either liberal Christian or proponents of a broad theism, while an equal number of congregations declared themselves to be staunch humanists. And they proposed that the foundations of our denomination would be better served by a common denominator of strictly ethical basis. There was a movement to eliminate all religious language from our liturgy, from our worship. Most agreed that the new developments meant that the old statement was inadequate. And it was feared the divisions would mean writing a whole new set of agreements, and it would be contentious. People would fight, they would argue. If the state were too humanist, the liberal Christians and broad theists would balk. And if the humanists felt it was too traditional, too spiritual, they would block the adoption of a new statement. Fortunately, there was an answer to the division. We needed to stop thinking of ourselves as two camps. First, many younger Unitarian Universalists made it clear they were neither humanist nor liberal Christian. Neither of those fit them. Some said they were Buddhists. Some emphasized spiritual naturalism. Some nature mysticism. Some argued they were Unitarian Universalists who honored the traditional liberal Christianity and humanism at the same time. And it was evident that the Unitarian Universalist community was not split into two warring camps. That understanding didn't serve us. There was a multiplicity of spiritual paths, of diversity and beliefs. We should end the divisiveness, the so-called humanist-theist debates. And they were debates. There were people who would debate at General Assembly and other places. We embraced many ways of being. We began to use a new concept to describe ourselves, a whole new idea in this period, pluralist. Pluralism means a community made up of many identities. In the late 20th century, we had come to understand that the United States is pluralist. There are Protestants, and Catholics and Jews. We've been saying that for a long time now. And since the 1950s, but increasingly we admit it, there were also Muslims and Buddhists and non-believers in religion. There were millions of religious humanists who loved the old stories, and secular humanists who thought all of the old stories were superstition. There were African Americans and all those people who were called Hispanic by the government. There were people from every nation in Asia living here in the United States, many as second and third generation Americans. The Chinese Americans go back to the railroad constructions in the United States. There were 8 million American Indians, Hawaiian natives, Alaskan natives. So Norman Rockwell's pictures of America that people had grown up with in the mid-20th century turned out to be pictures of maybe Western Massachusetts and not America at all. And we came to understand that some Catholics were old-time Irish and German stock, and some were newcomers from Vietnam and Mexico. And it was all pretty evident that not all Protestants thought alike, voted alike, or liked the same music. Think of Harvey Cox, Martin Luther King, and Franklin Graham. Not the same at all. The United States was pluralist. Was Unitarian Universalist pluralist at all? Had we gone beyond our old traditions of what we described as Unitarian Universalists in our story? Pluralist, really. Well, we know there's a big difference between the Unitarians and the Universalists and the pluralist United States. And that's what took us a few years to figure out. What was the difference between pluralism as practiced by the United States and pluralism as practiced by Unitarian Universalists? The United States has what we call exclusive pluralism. Exclusive pluralism. People of different faiths, different cultural values, different ethnicities, all live in the same country, even work in the same places, tolerate each other, commute on the same trains, but there's very little relationship between these communities. Very little understanding of each other. People seldom socialize together and have deep conversations together. Individual Catholics may know that Muslims exist in the United States, they may know that Muslims are their neighbors, but they do not make an effort to compare religions, understandings, talk about it with each other, to understand their similarities and differences. What most English-speaking European Americans know about Mexico and Mexican Americans is limited to food items and some musical styles. We live together. We obey the same laws. There's such a strong claim on the part of these communities to be Americans, constituent parts of the United States, constituent communities of the United States. But this kind of pluralism is more about tolerance than understanding. They stand on the same line in the supermarket with Hindus and Colombians. But as long as no one gets pushy, everybody works out fine, but that's not a real pluralism. The Unitarian Universalists loved their pluralism, but believed they went beyond tolerance. They didn't simply tolerate each other. So I think you can begin to understand when Unitarian Universalists first started recognizing that they were divided into theists and humanists, and understood that the Unitarian Universalist community had a diversity that was profound and multifaceted. There was some anxiety. There was all kinds of stories about people who were so scattered that they couldn't have a single core understanding of themselves. How could they stay together with these differences? Were we just a loose collection of individuals, each doing its own thing? Did it merely tolerate each other? This self-discovery was unfolding at the same time as a request on the part of Unitarian Universalist women for a rewrite of our founding statement of principles, to be less male-centered, male-gendered, to be more inclusive in language and get rid of that mankind thing. And stop calling it the spirit of creation, Lord or King. And a lot of our songs in the hymnal were about using Lord and King to describe the spiritual. The larger societies in the United States might be called pluralistic, but that was a tentative kind of pluralism, exclusive pluralism. What if our Unitarian Universalist pluralism was inclusive pluralism? What if Unitarian Universalists that were freely following Jesus, and there are tens of thousands of Unitarian Universalists who consider themselves Christian, learn about Unitarian Universalist Buddhists, and vice versa. Humanist, Christian, Hindu, nature mystic, and devotees of every ancient spiritualities can now sing in the same choir, blending their voices and their ideas, which if all of us could be in community, mutually enriching, being Unitarian Universalists together. Not a pluralism based on tolerance, but one based on shared values, common principles, ways of being together. The principles and purposes that we were developing performed that function together. We were together because we shared common values, not common beliefs. And they were the product of the discussion of over 1,000 congregations over almost 8 years. And we also acknowledge that the pluralist, multifaceted sources of our Unitarian Universalism, the living tradition we share, draws from many sources. And we've worked on that, but the idea that describing many sources helps ground our pluralism. The words and deeds of prophetic people, it was inclusive language. Wisdom from the world's religion inspires their ethical, spiritual life. So, affirming a pluralism that is both inclusive and mutually enriching, we came to and developed these principles and purposes at a stage. We've gotten to a new stage, and we're talking about revising Article 2. We're going to talk about that more in coffee hour discussions, and then look at what's happened.
Come to God.
We shall overcome. When we truly extend our love to one another, living in peace and freedom, we shall overcome the wrongs that have happened and the debts left unpaid. Let us join together in that commitment. Yes, we shall overcome. Go in peace. Go in love. Go in confidence.